Hi there, welcome back to a rather irregularly timed IndyCar on the 10th of July. I'm broadcasting today from a strange little enclave, the deepest part of the west end of Glasgow. But anyway, amidst all the rain and the gloom today, I thought I would explore the British media and the way it goes about trying, well, to present Britain as some kind of superpower. And there have been a lot of interesting things that have been happening in the media in the last few days. In fact, the last 24 hours, the BBC has had to issue a grovelling apology for wrongly stating that all coronations in Britain since 1066 have happened at Westminster Abbey. Now, it's obvious to anyone living in Scotland that 1066 Scotland was still independent. It crowned its own kings, its own monarchs were crowned at various important locations around Scotland for hundreds of years, well before anything that was happening in Westminster started to impinge on Scotland. So the BBC has had to issue an apology in this blanket statement that no coronations obviously happened in Scotland from 1066 until the current moment. What a load of nonsense. And yet this is being put out as a fact by the BBC. But not content with putting out nonsense like this, the BBC is also largely managed now by the Conservative Party, who've inserted their own policemen into important roles within the corporation. And that has caused, obviously, the BBC to become even more of a propaganda organisation than it once was. And it is now, I suppose it now means that the United Kingdom is effectively an authoritarian state with a similar amount of propaganda control over the media to that of the Kremlin. Which begs the question, are we actually living in a free democracy? And I would argue that we definitely aren't. And that is evidenced by new draconian powers given to the police by Westminster when it comes to people protesting, well, about anything really. But more specifically, these powers are now being used in Scotland to arrest people who just simply are protesting the fact that they don't believe the King is the King of Scotland. And to be arrested for simply stating a fact by simply shouting it out in a public place is not really a crime under anybody's definition of the word. And yet, under these new draconian powers, the police can use these powers to arrest people. And they did. They arrested 8 people during the procession of King Charles, the whatever he is, of England through the streets of Edinburgh, as I was reporting the other day. So we're now living in a dangerous police state which has a managed, I think, politically controlled propaganda wing running the state news media. But not content with that, it's not just bad enough that the politicians are interfering in the management of the BBC and its news output. We've now got senior political figures such as Jacob Rees-Mogg popping up on ridiculous news channels like the GB News, or as everybody tends to call it, CBeebies. Now, Jacob Rees-Mogg is an appalling presenter, hopelessly out of his depth, wooden in most of his presentations, and he was taken apart recently by John Nicholson MP, who quizzed him directly. And I think, we're beginning to see the writing on the wall now. The mainstream media is now basically being used as a political implement to beat Scotland into submission. And even more evidence of that came to the fore in the last few weeks, just simply because you will have known, obviously, because it's been in all the newspapers, it's been all across the mainstream media, that 7 SNP MPs are not planning to stand for re-election at Westminster. And the BBC and other news media from across the UK basically advertising this as a major blow to Humza Yousaf and the SNP. But they neglect to tell you that 43 Tory MPs are planning to not stand for election at the next general election themselves. 43 Tory MPs are taking themselves out of the political fight. But not only that, but somewhere in the region of, I think it's 14, Labour MPs are also standing down as well, not a cheap about it being a blow to either of those parties. Well, I guess that's what you would expect when you have a mainstream media which is directed by the party in government. But I think this is an indication now of just how desperate the British state government is, and the establishment, to make sure that the SNP is portrayed as a failed party. And more we're seeing reports daily on how the SNP is breaking up, how there is infighting within the SNP, how it's no longer the party it once was, and particularly favourite of the BBC, the resurgence of Labour in Scotland. But again, they neglect to tell you where these new Labour votes are coming from. They're not coming from the SNP. Labour is not taking votes off the SNP. They're simply taking votes off their friends in the Tory party. The Tories couldn't get elected in Scotland if they tried. And so Labour are now basically stealing their clothes. And it's there that the Labour Party is taking seats. And this is where all the vote shift is going on. These traditional Tory voters realising that their candidate is highly unlikely to get elected and the Labour candidate is far more likely to get elected, are tactically switching votes, and that is showing up in the polls. Again, none of this is analysed by the BBC or the mainstream British media because that would show the truth, and that is not that the SNP is weakening in any way, it's just that the Tories are weakening and Labour is taking advantage of that. However, it does beg the question, what is the SNP doing to reverse this apparent trend and to do something to counter this narrative that's constantly being fed into your homes through your televisions and radios and in your daily newspapers that the SNP is failing in some way? Right at the moment, the SNP is not failing anybody or anything. It is just going through the same process that the mainstream parties in Westminster are. There will be politicians who want to stand down and they will be replaced by other candidates. This is a normal part of the political process in every general election. There is nothing remarkable about it, and it's not a blow to anybody in particular. So when you're reading the news and you're beginning to feel depressed about what you're seeing, remember that the truth behind it is not being told to you. It's being withheld, and no analysis is being made of the United Kingdom's parties, or should I say the English registered parties, at all. But it's the Tories who are losing ground in Scotland. Labour's picking up the Tory vote. The SNP vote share may have appeared to have dropped in the polls, but on the other hand, when you fight the general election, you're not really fighting for independence, you're simply fighting for seats. And this is why, as I've said many times before, I don't think that a plebiscite election is a brilliant idea, because for one thing, we're not going to get vote share that we need, and we need a majority for that. And to do that, we need an actual lawful referendum, a proper Scottish referendum run by the Scottish state, involving Scottish institutions, and where other parties from outside of Scotland, such as Labour, the Tory party and the Liberal Democrats, are registered as parties from a foreign country, and that changes the whole complexion of the way people look at a referendum. Anyway, that's about it from me today, but I just wanted to point out a few things to you about the way the mainstream media appears to be presenting the state of Scottish politics at the moment. Remember, there is a vacuum of political news just now because all the politicians are away on their summer hauls. They will be back, I think mostly back in September, but on the other hand, in the meantime, we're being deluged with this guff from a Tory-run propaganda TV channel called the BBC, which incidentally also commissions work from STV. So even STV, which you would have thought was a Scottish broadcaster, is actually making programmes for the BBC and takes a lot of its news content directly from there. Also has to ask permission before commissioning is done. So basically anything that STV wants to make in the way of documentaries or other programmes has to be commissioned by the BBC. Strange, isn't it? How the BBC has basically got its hand around the throat of the Scottish media the entire time. But this is the country we live in. Our media is being controlled by a foreign country, is being controlled by an authoritarian state, and we can be arrested for simply objecting to the monarchy. This is the country that they want us to stay in. If this is a country that you don't want to stay in, then you need to vote for independence. And to do that, we need to have a referendum, and to do that we need the Scottish Government to take back its powers, take back the powers of Holyrood, and organise an actual proper referendum. That's it from me today. I will see you soon. In the meantime, stay out the rain and enjoy your week. I'll be back, I hope, in the next couple of days. Bye for now.